you know what, the story I really like, when they had the tsunami over in those islands, all the animals went up the hills.
Yeah.
And
So, good morning, everybody. I think we may start. Some of the clergy will be later. They have stuff on today. Good morning, everybody online. Thanks for joining us again. We can't see you, but I guess you can see us. So today we're going to kind of capitalize on what we've been doing the last 2 days, which is raking around stories of creation and especially wisdom stories from the Old Testament. I want to look at John 1 to 18, and I think you'll appreciate now with the background of yesterday how much it is inspired by Old Testament material. And here's a sequence. So we'll listen to John 1 to 18 and just notice any reactions or comments we might like to make. I'll talk about the genre. What kind of writing is it? Obviously a prologue. It has a literary structure, kind of concentric one. Then I'll comment on it. And we talk about backgrounds. So creation story and Moses, wisdom literature, a bit of Stoic philosophy. Its function in the gospel, and some conclusions and a prayer. So fairly straightforward. In terms of the pages, we should be on page 19. And there we are. And there's just the one page. So we'll hear the text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all peoples. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law, indeed, was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. I don't know if you have any spontaneous reaction from hearing that just right now, different translation than the usual, perhaps. Any observations? Don't mind. Or is it just a bit too early in the day to be observing?
it's really very wonderful. It's that's where I would use the word. It's awe-inspiring.
Yes, it is, yeah. It's a fabulous piece of writing. And what I hope to show you is that it's a prologue for the gospel, but a slightly peculiar one. And that it has a history, and that probably originally it was a hymn to wisdom. And probably originally it began with, in the beginning was wisdom, and wisdom was with God, and wisdom was God. Probably. Huh? And as you know, the word for wisdom in Greek is feminine, Sophia. So, and also in Hebrew, Chokhmah is also feminine. But here, the word is masculine. So originally there was a feminine poem about God, and then adjusted when it was taken into the gospel. Any other observations you'd like to make about it, or query, anything you'd like to ask about it? Happy to engage.
Just one other thing struck me, that we say the Angelus once a day in our place,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm always struck by that word, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us.
Yes, yeah. And that comes up here. And there are different translations of that. A translation that I'm very fond of is the NET, but it makes a mistake at that point. It says the word took up residence among us, as if he hired a flat in Nazareth or something, you know. It's kind of, it's a bit flat, huh? I talk about it in the commentary because the word for dwelt is literally tented, you know, which is a very rich meaning in the Bible. Huh?
And some people use the word became flesh.
Yes, and that's correct. The word became flesh.
Back to the Latin parapactamos.
Yes, but we have to go back to the Greek. The Greek is ageneto, became. So we have to go back to the Greek. The Greek is more original.
And is that became?
Yes, that's became, yeah. That's became. Uses that verb all the time. Any other engagement before I go on? Happy to interact.
Emphasis on the light.
There's great emphasis on the light. Now, and light is a symbol of salvation, you know, from the prophet Isaiah. And so the light is really, and light and contrast then with darkness, which we had at the very beginning here. Do you remember the book of Genesis, the very first day? And also, light is very important out in the gospel itself. And it's one of the points of continuity between this prologue and the rest of the gospel. Because in some ways, this prologue doesn't quite fit the rest of the gospel, because the image of the Word made flesh never comes up again in the gospel itself, in John's gospel. So it's a tiny little bit foreign, but then there are also very strong connections, such as light. And in the gospel, Jesus says, I am the light of the world, you know, and the man born blind in chapter 9 regains his sight, and so on. So there are quite strong story connections, even if the vocabulary of word made flesh doesn't really recur throughout the gospel, which it doesn't. Anybody else like to? Yeah. It's a very beautiful line, yeah, it is, yeah. And the Greek, it doesn't say cardia, which would be heart. It says bosom, as in Abraham's bosom. But there's bosom language in the Jewish culture of the period, which I'll show you when we come to it. So but it means place of affection, obviously, yeah? Closeness.
I find that a little bit strange. Verse 13, they were born not of blood.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of a funny expression.
Yes, it's trying to profile the origin in the spirit of those who come to believe in Christ. So it does it by negation. So, and a triple negation, not of blood, not of natural, it's not a natural birth, nor the will of the flesh, so the instinct, nor the will of man, so a human being wanted to have this to happen, but of God. So it's a way of emphasizing. One of the peculiarities is that in the lectionary translation, at that point, it doesn't say who were born, but who was born. And that is most likely a mistake in our current lectionary, because if it says who was born, then the reference is to Jesus, and it's a trace then, if you could call it that, in John's Gospel of the virginal conception of Jesus. You know, who was born not of blood, the will of man, but of God. But in fact, that's probably not correct. That all the Greek manuscripts say were born. So it's not Jesus, it's us. And that's a major difference in the lectionary. Yeah? The original Jerusalem Bible was very indebted to a French scholar called Boimard and Émile Boimard. And Émile Boimard discovered a Latin text which had "who was born," and in his understanding, even though there was only one example and it was in Latin, this probably reflected a more original text, he figured. But that nobody agrees with that nowadays. But it's still in our lectionary, and when the lectionary is changed, that'll be corrected. Nobody notices it. I'm sure you got over Christmas without this awful error paraded before you for the last 50 years. But it's a mistake. It's a mistake. Shall I go on a bit? Yeah, sure. Okay. Just to say, it's a prologue. So a prologue means prologue. So a word before the word. And it was a recognized form at the time in speeches, plays, and musical performances. And Cicero, the great Roman politician and lawyer, he wrote about what's the function of a prologue. And he said very nicely, one's opening remarks, though they should always be carefully framed and pointed and epigrammatic and suitably expressed, but at the same time must be appropriate to the case in hand. For the opening passage contains the first impression and the introduction of the speech, and this ought to charm and attract the hearer straight away. A good message for preachers. The first paragraph is very important. You have to charm and attract. Okay, do our best. That's what Cicero has to say about that. This is a prologue, but it's a little bit different. It doesn't tell us much, actually, about the prehistorical episodes of the word's pre-existence. We get very little about that. It's very opaque, in fact. It also isn't exactly an overture, because some vocabulary never comes back in the gospel, such as logos, word, grace, and fullness, which are very important in the prologue. They never come back, strangely. And some, of course, some powerful stuff does come back, as Mary was pointing out, light, life, and darkness. They come back throughout the gospel. And I'll show you at the very end how adequate a prologue, actually, this prologue is. So this is not a historical resume of the story to follow. The cross and resurrection are absent. Now, the cross is a tiny bit in there because of the rejection. But the resurrection is not really in there. So it's a somewhat different kind of a thing. And that would indicate maybe perhaps its origin somewhere else. That this wasn't written for the gospel, but was taken by the gospel writer and adjusted for use here. And that's a helpful way, I think, to think about it. Another comment would be this. Very often in the Bible, I mean, you'd be surprised how often stories and poems and wisdom things, they fall into a pattern which can be concentric, like A, B, A. You know, you say something, you say something else, and you come back to the first thing you said. Very often, huh? And very often that can be extended into a longer pattern, A, B, C, D, C, B, A. Very often. It's a memorization device where people can kind of a mnemonic. And here's the prologue, how it divides up like that, just show you. Is that fairly visible? Yeah. Now the text, as you see, is down the middle. And just to show you the bits that are paired. So verses 1 and 2 in kind of blue at the top, that's the Word and God. And you jump down to verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son who is himself God and is in closest relation with the Father, has made him known. So you get Word and God at the end, kind of a frame. In green, you have the benefit from the Word. Through him all things were made, and so on. And in green below, of his fullness we have all received, grace upon grace. And then you have the little interruption about John the Baptist. The prologue is basically poetry, but there are a couple of prose interruptions. So there's a prose interruption when John the Baptist comes in. You jump from the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Then you get a story. There was a man sent from God, very different. So John the Baptist, that's probably an insertion. And then if you go down to the red one, the whatever colour that is, orange, see below verse 15, you get more about John the Baptist. John testified concerning him, saying. So they match up. And then if you look at D and D, the light, the true light gives light, was coming into the world. And then at 14 also D, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So in D and D you have incarnation. Incarnation. And then in the centre, around which the whole thing kind of pivots, to use that nice contemporary word, you get a mixture of rejection and reception. And the net result then is being born of God. There's a slightly different translation. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. That's rejection number 1. He came to his own, to what was his own, but his own did not receive him. That's the people of Israel. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And that takes us then to the centre, and that puts the kind of that puts the speculation of the prologue, which can be very theological, into a very practical context. It puts before us a choice: will we accept or reject? And if we accept, then we can become children of God. So the whole thing focuses in on the pastoral benefit of being a believer in Jesus, for us today. I think that makes sense, doesn't it? And the pattern is interesting. That's the final pattern that it has. And as I say, it's probably the case that this was, I'll show you at the very end, that this was some kind of an original hymn, and that the writer co-opted it into the text and then made adjustments according to make it fit the gospel fairly well.
It's just interesting, it's A, B, C, D, but then at the bottom it's reversed.
Yes, that's what happens with these.
A, B, C,
That's what happens to these patterns. They're A, B, A, or A, B, C, B, A. They go into a pattern like that. Let's see the previous slide. That's what happens with these. These things they're called concentric patterns. And they're more frequent than you'd imagine. I mean, they really are quite frequent. You wouldn't see it straight away now, but the Emmaus story is concentric. The Sermon on the Mount is concentric. So there are all these concentric patterns. They're to help your memory and to get a grasp of the whole thing, and also to profile what's at the centre. If you look at the Emmaus story, the centre is how slow of heart to believe. So the whole story is about how do you get over a low heartbeat in the faith. And if you look at the centre of the Sermon on the Mount, bang in the middle, literally bang in the middle, is the Lord's Prayer. And the teaching is, if you want to live all this vision and all these values, you must be a person who takes to heart the Lord's Prayer. So it's very helpful, actually. It's not just literary games. It's to remember and also to profile what's at the centre. And here, in the middle of all this kind of marvellous, elevated theology, the writer is saying at the centre of it is something very practical. The choice of believing in the Word made flesh and being then a child of God as a result. So very pastoral, in fact. Does that make sense, Cora? Yeah, but it's very free. You'd be surprised how frequent it is. Psalm 8 is concentric. There's bundles of stuff. The Book of Wisdom is full of concentric patterns. Amazing. Anyway, enough on the poor old literature. This slide is a correction on the one that went up online. I changed the commentary on the right, and I'll put all that. I'll send that around properly with all the. I've corrected the spelling on the slides and a few things here and there, and I'll send it on the slides when I get home. So it starts just commentary. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Now, clearly, where we started, the book of Genesis, is evoked. That's clear. And so he's taking us back to origin in creation. And as we saw from the book of Genesis, Word is the means of creation. So God simply said. And we saw, as we shall see later, that behind this idea of the pre-existence of the Word, so the Word was with God, and then the Word became flesh, it's quite like wisdom being in God's mind, and then wisdom coming out of God's mind. So it's very, very similar. The word with God, pros, it's in Greek, there are several words for with in Greek, and the word is pros. It means a close and authoritative relationship with God. So not simply alongside, but working closely with is the idea. The word was God, of course, is unprecedented. That's nowhere else. You won't find that in the Old Testament anywhere. It looks forward to something at the end of John's Gospel when Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." So the biggest story of doubt in the Gospel of John leads to the biggest affirmation of faith. My Lord and my Lord and my God. You might miss the fact that affirmation, which sounds so kind of elevated and theological, is actually quite political. When this was written, the emperor in Rome was Domitian, and Domitian's preferred form of address was Dominus et Deus Noster, our Lord and our God. So, as you know, for the Roman emperors, low self-esteem wasn't a big issue. And so what it means is that while my Lord and my God is, of course, highly theological, it's also actually in the context highly political. It's saying there is a different set of values, a different vision, and a different loyalty. Because the Roman Empire claimed complete loyalty from its subjects. So it's a very different world. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life. And the life was the light of all people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And as we saw, that this is an evocation of Lady Wisdom that should be familiar to us. All things came into being through him. And you just switch the pronouns. All things came into being through her, and without her not one thing came into being. What came into being in her was life. And suddenly you have all the Lady Wisdom stuff is back in our minds again. And the important images there are life, which means not only existence, the gift of simply being, but also the fullness of life, which comes out in John's Gospel. I came that may have life and have it to the full, if you remember. And the raising of Lazarus is the graphic illustration of life. Light, as Mary points out, is there. Spiritual illumination, and also a symbol of salvation. And this light is for all humanity without distinction. Darkness is in there as well. The writer is aware of opposition to what God is doing in Jesus. That also comes up across the Gospel. Then we get a little interruption. We come down from the poetry and we step into prose. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. You may not be aware, but the followers of John the Baptist still exist. They're called the Mandeans. There was a religious body surrounding him, and it flourished throughout the first century, long after the death of John the Baptist and Jesus. And the core group in the John community, the core group was ex-followers of John the Baptist. They're the core bunch that makes up the John community. Yeah? And the gospel writer is very anxious to make sure that John is second class and Jesus is first class. So he takes the opportunity to break the poetry and stick this stuff in so we get clear who this character is. Later on, he puts on the lips of Jesus the words quoted from Isaiah in Mark's Gospel. Do you remember? The voice of one crying in the wilderness. And in John's Gospel, John the Baptist says it. It's not just a quotation from Isaiah. So it coming from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But that's all to do with the anxiety of the gospel writer, because there are still followers of John the Baptist who could always say, our prophet baptized your prophet, the greater gives to the lesser. Our guy is more important than your guy. And that could easily be argued right up to the end. And they still exist today, fairly secretive. The Mandean, a fairly secretive bunch. But the gospel writer is very clear to me, and then later on the gospel, he is the bridegroom, I am the friend of the, remember all that stuff, to make sure that we see that John is secondary. So big, kind of a largish anxiety, really. Yeah? So this is the first mention of John, and there's curiously, there's no need to identify him. It doesn't say John the Baptist, because everybody for whom this gospel was written knows about John. We know which John is meant kind of straight away. Now he is sent from God, so he's an important person, a prophet, and he is sent then to witness and to testify. And the Greek there for witness and testify is martureo. He's to be a witness bearer. Huh? And all are to believe through him, and absolutely not to believe in him. So the gospel writer is anxious. And then in case we didn't get it, he says with great clarity, he himself was not the light. Okay, don't get mixed up. But he came to testify to the light. So fair enough. Little bit of anxiety. Then it says, by contrast, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Now, it's important to remember that in John's Gospel, the word true doesn't mean simply factually the case, which is what true means. It means also faithful and reliable. So it has a richer meaning than simply veracity or facticity, so to speak. And that's true across it. We'll see it again. The word for true in Greek translates the Hebrew word. Now, the word in Greek is aletheia, means truth. The word in Greek is emeth, which means faithfulness. So in the sense that God is true to his people, God is reliable, God is faithful. So it's different. It's a different kind of a thing. Yeah? So light then is a metaphor for salvation throughout this gospel. And enlightens everyone. The great story of the man born blind is a kind of climactic story in John's Gospel. And then he was coming into the world. This picks up an ancient messianic hope in the Jewish tradition. Just before Jesus was born, Jesus was the Messiah was referred to as the coming one. Very, very broad. He was coming into the world, and this means the cosmos. You may be delighted to know that cosmos means beautiful, from which the word cosmetics. So if you have done any cosmic improvements on yourself this morning, that's where you've been. Now in John's Gospel, cosmos has two meanings, which can be confusing. One meaning is it's creation. The world, which is good, the beautiful cosmos. It also means that part of creation which is against God. So the two meanings are in there, and you have to decide each time which one we're operating with. So it's a pity you use the same word for the two things, as you get mixed up. Something similar happens in St. Paul, where he talks about the flesh. And obviously flesh is good, to be human is good, but he also uses the word flesh to talk about that part of the human being which is against God. And it's a pity that he uses the word flesh, because it's just confusing. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own. His own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born, not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. So here we have pictured two different responses. And this time the word world is negative. The world did not know him. So that doesn't mean creation, it means those human beings who were against Jesus. And that does foreshadow the ministry of Jesus, where there's a great deal of conflict in John's Gospel. He also comes to his own, this time meaning Israel. And the makeup of the John community was ex-followers of John the Baptist, ex-Samaritans, ex-Pharisees, and ex, so to speak, Gentiles. That's the mix. So there's a fair bit of his own in there. So Pharisees and followers of John the Baptist are straight up Jews. Samaritans are kind of cousins. Gentiles are out on the edge a little bit. But anyway, he came to his own, did not accept him. And by contrast then, to all who did receive him, who believed in his name. And this then becomes for all of humanity. And in John's Gospel, I was going to say you wouldn't believe this, but the word belief occurs in this Gospel 98 times. It's 98 times. It's hugely important, the word belief in this Gospel. The word to believe. It's never a noun, it's always a verb. It was really, really important. You can see that in the resurrection scene with Thomas. Happy are those who have not seen and yet believe. And at the first ending at the end of chapter 21, these things are written so that you may believe. So it's really important in this Gospel. As I say, it's never a noun, it's never a system, it's never a doctrine, it's an activity. And it means to trust. Here's our wonderful passage. And the Word became flesh, and there's your Greek, egeneto. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we've seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Now the important word in there, flesh means human existence in its fragility, transience and mortality. None of us need reminding of this, I guess, but that's just who we are. Now the verb there, to live, I put it into Greek. Do you see it? Eskenosen. Now the verb for a tent in Greek is skene. And there's a verb, skenoo, to camp. So I don't quite know why they don't translate it as camped, because that's really what it means. And it's a very strong echo of what we saw yesterday from the book of Sirach in chapter 24. Because in the book of Sirach, I'll just read the passage there. The Creator of all things gave me wisdom, a command, and my Creator chose me the place for my tent, my skene. He said, make your dwelling, kateskoneson, in Jacob, and in Israel is receive your inheritance. Now that language of tent has a huge echo in the Old Testament, because Moses and the people met God in the tent of meeting. This portable shrine that they carried around in the desert. Hi, morning. Are you okay?
Yeah, we're just sitting.
Oh, of course you can, yeah. We're in the middle of stuff now. You're all right?
That's fine.
Where we are is we're looking at the prologue of John's Gospel, just John 1:1-18. And we've spent yesterday looking at wisdom books, and what I'm trying to show is that behind this wonderful opening paragraph of John's Gospel is reflection from the Old Testament about wisdom. That's what I'm doing, if that makes sense in brief. Okay. Anyway, welcome. Also in this Gospel, there is the Festival of Tabernacles is huge. You mightn't realize this, but John's Gospel is arranged according to the Jewish feasts. Chapter 5 is Sabbath. Chapter 6 is Passover. 7, 8, and 9 and a bit of 10 are the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Booths, where ancient, and now also today, Jews and Israelis, they make temporary dwellings in their gardens and they spend the night in them to remind themselves of the time when they were wandering in the desert. This is where the Greek for the Feast of Tabernacles is, I put it there, is skenopegia. So the word skene is in there as well. Do you see that? To camp. Huh? And I put there also references to the tent of meeting. So that's for me the most important thing there in all of that is the word lived, the word eskenosen, because that has a huge echo of encounter, meeting, festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, the wisdom who came to dwell, and so on. It's a huge, powerful echo. Do you want to ask anything about that before I go on?
It's just a translation is a problem in a sense, because that lived we have and dwelt among us.
Yes, I know. Yeah. It can be difficult. I mean, as I say, the translation I like very much is the NET, and it says they have there took up residence. That really isn't good. Why not simply say tented?
Yes.
You know, it's a perfectly good verb in English. Or camped.
Tent
You know.
now is very common in Africa.
Yeah,
You know, people understand
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Fine.
Why not say that? You know, why not say that? And there's another echo which you mightn't pick up. Sometimes the writer of John's Gospel was not his first language is not Greek, because the Greek is terribly simple and I won't say primitive, but it's very simple. His first language is Hebrew and Aramaic. It's I think clear enough. And one of the really resonance words in the Old Testament for the presence of God in the temple, if you remember, was the Shekinah. Remember that word, the Shekinah, and it's Shekinah and eskenosen, skene. He's probably playing on words, you know, so that the Greek sounds a bit like the Hebrew, Shekinah, eskene. You know, a little complex play on words, echoing the presence of God in the temple, in the tent of meeting. That's the honours course, in case you get asked, and who wants to be a millionaire, and remember us when you come into your kingdom. Anyway, the only Son. So the image there is very powerful. The monogenes. So the only Son. And he's full of grace and truth. Now, each of those words there is really important. You see that? The word full, pleres, which does recur in the gospel, the adverb, in a number of important places, including life in abundance. The word grace is charis, which our word charismatic, yeah? And that really means the unaccountable gift of God's covenant love. Often called, it's hesed in Hebrew, but it's often translated as steadfast love. And it does need a word to go with it. It's not just love. It's the committed covenant love that will be always there no matter what. And then he's full of grace and truth. And truth is, as I was saying to you earlier, it's not simply veracity or facticity, it's interpersonal. It means relational reliability, in the sense of to be true to someone. So that's really, I think, really important. The Latin translated it as veritas, which is just not right. I don't know if you remember. Some of you are nearly as old as I am. But remember Psalm 114, Laudate Dominum. Et veritas Domini manet in aeternum. Et veritas Domini. The truth of the Lord lasts forever, in the Vulgate translation. In the modern Latin translation, it doesn't say et veritas Domini. It says, I think very correctly, et misericordia Domini. The mercy of God. Much better word for the translation. Anyway. Then I put there the full business of truth and true in John's Gospel. They're all the references. You can find them on Think Yourself. That comes to a great personal story in John chapter 14, if you remember. I am the way, the truth, and the life. A very rich expression. Because the word way there is hodos, and it means the way of the gospel. You know, it's a very strong image. Remember in the Acts of the Apostles, where the preaching is simply called the way. And then he's the truth, but that's not facticity. That's interpersonal, relational truth. I will be faithful to you. And then life, the gift of resurrected life, really, in the case of John's Gospel. So very rich, as you can see. A couple of words here and there always have a kind of a deeper meaning. And then the writer feels obliged to interrupt himself again with a bit of storytelling. Now, just to say, there are no brackets in ancient Greek. They didn't have brackets. But translators always put this into brackets because it's clearly an interruption of some sort. John testified to him and cried, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." That's again putting John into his little box to make sure we don't think that he's greater than Jesus. He comes then to, he testified and cried out. That's a little anticipation of, I am the one crying out, the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness. That comes in later on in the same chapter. And immediately following all of this, in chapter 1, verse 19, there's a whole business about who is John the Baptist. And he goes to awful trouble to explain, are you the prophet? Are you the Messiah? Are you the one who was to come? He says, no, 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 no. Who are you? It was very emphatic in the rest of chapter 1 in John's Gospel. And later on in the Gospel, you get a very powerful sentence. Jesus said to them, and this obviously breaks the rules of grammar, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. That's the tense I am is wrong, obviously. It should read, before Abraham was, I was before him, would be the proper sentence. But I am is the name of God in the Old Testament. At the burning bush, I am who I am. And in Greek that comes out, ego eimi. And throughout John's Gospel, the I am sentences are really significant, and it suggests Jesus was God eternally in being, and so the present tense is perfectly appropriate here. So very, very strong. There are 7, well done, there are 7 great I am sentences. Can you remember them? Is that too much pressure? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection of the life, the bread of life, the light of the world, the good shepherd, and the gate. Well done. Bravo. Yeah. And it's not accidental that they are 7. Because 7 is a number of perfection. So the numbers play a certain amount of importance in the Gospel of John, hugely in the Apocalypse, but in the Gospel of a certain amount of importance. I'll give you a funny example. Do you remember the number of fish they catch at the miraculous catch of fish? Do you remember the number? 153. You were close. You were close. And people wondered, what could that possibly mean? Because nothing is accidental. The writer has chosen every single bit, you know. And there was a writer of the period who was a geographer called Strabo. And Strabo, according to his information, discovered that the number of species of fish in the sea was 153. And so it's to do with universality of mission. So it's a kind of a symbol of the mission is universal. Lovely image. Of course, in the tradition, they tried to do other things with it. St. Augustine very famously said, if you add up all the numbers from 1 to 17, you'll get to 153. And why 1 to 17? Well, obviously, the 10 Commandments and the 7 Sacraments. Yeah. Anyway, what you can do with the imagination is always good. Huh? Now, here's a lovely passage. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That's a slightly mysterious passage. It takes us back to the benefit of creation. Now, the phrase grace upon grace is a funny expression. In Greek, it's charin anti charitos, and it could mean 3 things. Love, which is grace, under the new covenant in place of love, grace under the Sinai covenant, thus some kind of story of replacement, one on top of the other. Or grace on top of kind of accumulation, more. Or corresponding to grace. It could simply mean corresponding to grace. And probably number 2 is what the writer has in mind. Yeah, that's more intuitively accurate. On grace on top of grace is what he has in mind there. You can see the importance of grace. Here's a passage from the Exodus, from the Greek translation that we saw the first day. If then I found favour, charis, before you, disclose yourself to me, let me see you recognizably, in order that I may find favour, charis, before you, in order I might know that this nation is your people. So that's the word grace, translating chesed in Hebrew, the steadfast love of God. Huh? So lovely passage there. I'm going to stay with that for a moment. Do you see this contrast, law and grace? Now, I wonder if you would feel kind of automatically that actually mightn't quite belong here, because law-grace contrast is kind of stuff you find in Paul. And people do wonder if the wisdom hymn had first of all been received in a Pauline community, and they added into it this law-grace contrast, which is possible. And I'll show that later when I show you how the hymn was kind of constructed. And then you have this very full sentence: the law was given through Moses, as one idea. Grace and truth, as charis and aletheia, come through Jesus, and you get the full name Jesus Christ, which is rare enough in John's Gospel.
Is it kind of configuring, that whole question which we can sometimes take up wrong, that Jesus has replaced the law, or the fullness
That's the risk.
Yeah.
That's the risk. There's a question being asked there. What's the relationship between the first covenant and the second covenant? And one document in the New Testament is what you might call supersessionist. So one takes over from the other. That's the letter to the Hebrews, and it more or less says the first covenant was abolished, which is very severe. Now, Paul himself doesn't teach that, because Paul teaches continuity and that God's grace is never withdrawn. And this gospel here, which is very aware of a separation from Judaism, very aware, also does not teach replacement. Yeah? Yes. That's in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel only. And it's probably a reaction from Matthew, who's afraid that the liberalism of Paul might lead to the ditching of the moral law of the Old Testament. So Matthew is a bit anxious there. A lot of anxiety around the New Testament. Anyway. This then comes to a lovely conclusion, really. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. And here's the translation in the NIV, not my favourite translation, but one of you here sports it. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side has made him known. And the word for I'll show the next slide. Golly. The word for I'll show the next slide. The word for heart is really means bosom. There's a question about only Son or only God. And there's a text problem there. The manuscripts aren't quite in agreement about how that should be translated. And only Son gets a B rating in the standard edition of the Greek New Testament, which means it is almost certain, but not quite. Fair enough. Then I'll show you the stuff about the bosom. It's kind of interesting. Heart or side is really bosom. So why not keep the imagery of breast or bosom? Why not? And in fact, it occurs in these are poems of the period. The Odes of Solomon are not the same as the Psalms of Solomon. These are kind of Christian poems, and they have this stuff in them. This is God speaking. I fashioned their members, and my own breasts I prepared for them, that they might drink my holy milk and live by it. An unexpectedly maternal image of God. Huh? In the Ode of Solomon, number 19, the Son is the cup, and the Father is he who was milked, and the Holy Spirit is she who milked them. Very strange imagery for us, huh? Because his breasts were full, and it was undesirable his milk should be released without purpose. The Holy Spirit opened her bosom and mixed the milk of the two breasts of the Father. That's very kind of graphic for us, but that's but that language is available in early Christianity, as you can see. Good. Anyway, that's a rake over the story. Would you mind if I went on? Just to draw to some kind of a conclusion. You notice the narrative insertions that we saw, and the writer then disturbs the poetry. And there are adjustments such as Paul and law and grace, which seem not to be part of John's vision. And there are other adjustments which fit the evangelist's theology and concerns. Now, here are interruptions. Commentaries. Without him was not end that was made. That seems to interrupt negatively a passage. Then there's the John passage, and then the true light is also probably an addition. And all who believe in who are born not of, they're probably all editorial additions of some sort for different reasons for arguing that. And this is a picture of how this poem may have come to have been. There may originally have been a Jewish hymn to wisdom at the very bottom level. Do you see it? And I'll show you a potential text for that. And then there were some early Christian modifications. So it may have found its way into Pauline churches, and somehow the law grace thing got attached to it. And then above that, then the evangelist additions and modifications, which are considerable. So it has a little bit of history behind, because it's an edited text. So I'll show you this. I won't dwell on this thing. But you see, here's a hymn to a potential reconstruction of the original hymn to wisdom. I'll show you the complete text in a moment. But the thing to notice is the stuff on the right, where the references are. Do you see that? In the beginning was wisdom. Well, we saw Proverbs 8. We saw Wisdom 6. We saw Sirach 24. Wisdom was with God. Proverbs 8, Wisdom 9, so, and you can go right down through the whole text and see where there are references to the wisdom tradition throughout. This is all available on a slide, so you don't worry about writing it down. If you go over leaf, it goes on. Do you see it? In the world she was. So that's Wisdom 8 and Sirach 24. The world didn't know her. Proverbs 1, Baruch 3, various bits and pieces. She came to her own, Sirach 24. And then another book we haven't looked at, 1 Enoch 42. And so on. But in other words, there's a considerable connectedness with stuff. And if you went back and tried to say, what does that original hymn actually look like? Here's a sketch of it with the bits taken out. Okay? So here goes. In the beginning was wisdom. And wisdom was with God, and God divine was wisdom. The same she was in the beginning with God. All things through her became. What became in her was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness did not extinguish it. In the world she was, and the world through her became, and the world did not know her. Unto her own she came, and her own did not receive her. But as many as received her, she gave them authority, children of God, to become. And wisdom tabernacled among us, and we beheld her glory. Yes, it's lovely. And it's lovely to see the feminine version of it.
So just tell me again, where did all that come from?
That's a scholar's reconstruction of the original hymn behind the prologue of John. If you go back here, these texts more or less tell you where it kind of comes from, do you see? Where the references are. Pardon? Yes, yeah, exactly. The prologue is originally probably a Christian Jewish hymn to wisdom. And then it was taken and went with various modifications and then used at the beginning of the gospel. But the gospel writer made significant changes to it in order to incorporate it. So one of the significant changes is the story of John the Baptist is inserted, as you could see. The other big significant change is he moved the major imagery from wisdom, feminine, to word, which is masculine. Now that's a major shift. Now, there are losses and benefits in that. There's obviously the loss of the feminine. That's a severe loss. Huh? The benefits of Logos are it puts the story of Jesus into a different context. So, Logos, first of all, means a prophetic word. So Jesus then is the bearer of the word of God. So it's a significant gain changing over to the word Logos. Another gain is that Jesus himself is the word of life. So when we proclaim the word of the gospel, we're proclaiming the person Jesus. And so that's another gain and relates then to the historical Jesus. Another big gain for the writing of the time was the word logos, as we saw the other day, was used by Stoic philosophers to mean the presence of God in all reality. Remember that patterning of reality, like wisdom in the Jewish books. Huh? And that's very powerful in the philosophy of the period, that there's an inherent structure in all that is, and it reveals the presence and plan of God. And when it says then the word became flesh, there's an echo of all that Stoic philosophy. So the writer is retrieving Jewish traditions, but rereading the whole thing into a more universal context. So there are quite strong benefits as well to them to switch over, even though, as I say, there's a major loss as well. So let's kind of little details that we've seen before. Huh? Hence is thought that the Hellenistic version of the hymn added some verses to it, full of grace and truth. From her fullness we've all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And then if you want to put the whole thing together, it's a funny thing to do here, isn't it? This captures the original hymn, which is in grey underneath. It captures the Hellenistic editions in italics. It captures the John stuff in a kind of bright blue, and the editorial editions in the dark colour. Do you see it? So you get a picture then of the evolution of the whole hymn. So I'll read it. Why not? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And then a comment. And without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life. And the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and lived among us, Eskenason, and we've seen his glory. The glory of a Father's only Son. And then you get the Pauline contrast, full of grace and truth. And back to prose, John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead because he was before me." And then back then to more commentary. From his fullness we've all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one's ever seen God. Is the Father's only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who's made him known. And that gives you a picture then, you see, of what the poem would have looked like here. Go back another page. Oops, too far back. Too far back. This one here. The poem, the Hellenistic wisdom poem, which could fit into a Jewish worldview very easily. And then its adjustment, very strong adjustment, for its place in this gospel, with the various traditions registered. And having looked at the stuff yesterday, that should be okay for you to spot. At least I hope it is anyway. You know, not too technical. Huh? And so we get pluses and minuses. So negatively, you have opposition to Torah wisdom ideology. So that's spirituality of the period, which tended to undervalue the incarnation of Jesus. Opposition of defective wisdom Christology, more or less the same thing, and there's a loss of the feminine imagery of God. But there are positive things. Because he's able to say, in the beginning was the Word, you have creation and new creation. You have Logos, Word, which is transcendence and wisdom. You know, wisdom and Word really do belong together. It takes in prophecy. Jesus was a prophet. The Gospel, which is simply the Word of life. Jesus, God's presence and revelation. And there's dialogue with the culture, both with Judaism and Stoicism. So it's quite a sophisticated move to try and make this poem resonant more widely for all of humanity. And then by way of showing how all that kind of works, those are the backgrounds. We've seen this many times. The story of creation is in there. The Exodus is in there because of law and grace. Lady wisdom is very powerfully in there. Jewish wisdom literature, especially the fellow I mentioned a few times, Philo of Alexandria, the Logos philosophy of Stoicism, and so on. So there's quite a bit of stuff in this packed into this story. The Stoicism is really more important than we imagine. At the same time, it does work as a prologue. So I put here a list of the things where it really does work. So we have new creation. It works across the gospel. John's gospel teaches that the resurrection of Jesus is a new creation. If you remember, the risen Jesus says to the disciples, he breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit, just like the Lord breathing on Adam and putting life in the clay. Then the word life, of course, recurs again and again. The Lazarus story is a huge one. Light occurs again and again. The Baptist is important in this gospel as a contrasting figure. They did not know him, and that's the rejection by most of Jesus' contemporaries, which is found across the gospel. Children and being born. The classic one is, excuse me, the classic one is the Nicodemus story. Must be born of water and the Spirit. The story about flesh, that's Thomas, and unless I put my hands in his side. The glory in this gospel means the disclosure of God's identity. The Father's only Son comes up in the lovely prayers in John 13 to 17, the farewell discourse. Truth is throughout the gospel. Pilate has the very famous question in the trial in John's gospel, what is truth? Pilate asks brilliant questions. I'd put him top of the class. He also says of Jesus, which is a great question, where are you from? It's a fantastic question. And then throughout the gospel, the I am sentences that you noticed, before Abraham was, I am, and made known. This whole gospel is about revelation. So in fact, the prologue, even though it's foreign, actually fits very well for the job of this text here. And my idea in bringing it together, just to summarize, it is a fabulous prologue finding into the whole gospel. It had a prehistory, as we just saw, in wisdom stuff. It spoke to Israelite, Jewish and Stoic traditions. It prepared the John community to read the whole gospel, because there is an anticipation, and it's often offered radical, breathtaking teaching on the identity of Jesus, because it was never said of wisdom became flesh. That was never said. Now, she turned up in the book of the law, she turned up in the temple, but she never became flesh in that sense. So that's a strong about the identity of Jesus. Identity of Jesus. And very rich thing, can speak to us today. I mean, I would say it's about origins. People look for their identity through their origins. The quest for God. Then what we found regularly in the wisdom books, the beyond of God, God's transcendence, and the intimacy with God, so immanence, and God's engagement with us through Christ. And I think this passage here is then also one of the bridge passages for reflecting on Christianity and ecology and environment as well, because it takes up exactly the wisdom stuff, which is what that's precisely about. Good, I'll stop there. That's loads of stuff. Did you want to ask anything or make any comment yourselves on all of that? Happy to chat.
Just to make sure that it's all going to be on is it on our phones or are we getting this on paper?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, good.
And you won't get it on paper, you'll get it online. You get it online, yeah. Yeah. They're all these things are up on my website. I need to update it because I made some corrections to the various slides on my own website, and you can download them. I just need to make some corrections. But then you don't have to write all this stuff down, I'd be very happy if you went away from this morning to say that the prologue of John is a very rich reception of what we were looking at yesterday. The wisdom stuff. And it's great that we had the opportunity to, often when you're teaching John's Gospel, there isn't time to go through the wisdom stuff the way we went through it yesterday. So it's I think it's very rich then, and you begin to feel the echoes. Anybody like to comment in any shape or form? Well, we can say a prayer together here, folks. That's not forbidden, is it? So we can pray together. We praise you, gracious God, for the glad tidings of peace, the good news of salvation. We have seen his glory. Let the radiance of that glory enlighten the lives of those who celebrate his birth. Reveal to all the world the light no darkness can extinguish, our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, in the splendor of eternal light, God, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks very much for your patience with all that stuff this morning. Okay.